My purpose in this seminar is to reflect on why something which is widely considered the basis of good pedagogy in many global settings should also both be widely criticised as a failed educational idea and indeed treated with considerable suspicion by some of those considering educational trends from the outside. Before I address this question, I need to make two confessions about my past and ask for forgiveness for one of my actions going forward into this talk. The first confession is that my perspective derives from work in the specialist field of science education, which, along with mathematics education, is an area where constructivism has been especially influential, and therefore I have a bias. The discussion in this paper is not limited to that focus, but inevitably my thinking is coloured by my own experiences, as any good constructivist would acknowledge. And that is my second confession. I am a card-carrying constructivist, who has strongly encouraged constructivist thinking through my teaching and writing, and who has at least aspired to be a constructivist teacher. That does not mean I will intentionally offer a one-sided account, as I wish to examine the paradox that constructivism can be so many things to different people. So I'm seeking an explanation for this apparent paradox, rather than looking to simply champion one side in the debate. Nonetheless, a good constructivist is likely to feel that one's position and viewpoint inevitably influence how one understands any phenomenon. To be a constructivist, yet to claim a completely neutral and objective position, would seem to be like a pacifist who seeks to bring about world peace by eliminating everyone opposed to the idea. Having acknowledged my past, and therefore what brings me to where and who I am now, I seek your indulgence for the sin of oversimplification. A very pertinent question is whether there is such a thing as constructivism, or whether actually the term is used to cover a multitude of sins, or indeed virtues. That is certainly very relevant to today's topic, but as a starting point at least, I will use the term constructivism as if it has a single referent. But if I am talking about constructivism as though it is a unitary thing we can discuss under a single label, then what is it? What is constructivism? Perhaps I should make some suggestions to the audience for consideration. So, in the interest of objectivity, here is an objective, multiple-choice question.
Constructivism is A. The basis of an extensive program of research in education, especially science and mathematics education. B. A guide to effective teaching that best meets the needs of learners and helps teachers teach in ways that reflect what we know about human learning. C. One of a set of wishy-washy, trendy approaches to student-centered teaching which have been repeatedly found to be entirely ineffective. D. A philosophical stance which rejects objectivity and external reality and sees the world, as well as knowledge of it, as socially constructed. E. All of the above.
I wonder which of these options seems to today's audience to best fit the label, and even whether some may have their own rather different alternatives. In a traditional seminar, the type they had in pre-COVID days, where the person giving the paper was in the same room as those listening to it, the presenter would be looking around the room seeking cues in facial expressions as to whether the presentation was being understood and engaged with. That is less easy when the audience is dispersed, and people may be listening in on the train, in the bath, or whilst crunching their breakfast. Whatever your responses to my question were, I expect most of you will have appreciated that each of those responses is an authentic option, in the sense of reflecting how constructivism has sometimes been characterised. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of constructivism as a theory of learning, before considering what this means for constructivist teaching, if indeed we accept that there is such a thing. Later, I will consider what constructivism has to do with knowledge claims in research and the disciplines. Even in the area of constructivism and learning, there are various ideas on what makes a learning theory constructivist. So, for example, I have seen constructivist accounts of learning juxtaposed against cognitivist learning theories, as if incompatible alternatives. That distinction does not make good sense to me, as my brand of constructivism is informed by various threads of research into learning, including those that might be considered as cognitivist. So, for example, research suggests that the limited capacity of human working memory puts a severe limit on the processing of novel material, which can be understood within a constructivist perspective as a constraint on how readily someone can make sense of unfamiliar, complex information. So, I am offering a quick sketch as to what I understand as being fundamental to constructivism as learning theory. This is not hubris in assuming that my take on constructivism is the right one, or optimal, or better than anyone else's in some way, but simply that I have privileged access to my own thoughts, and it's the only version I can speak about with genuine authority. A core axiom is that a person does not have direct, unmediated access to knowledge of the world. We have sensory apparatus that provides interfaces with the external world, external to our own minds that is, but the information derived from our senses is a resource for making sense and does not directly offer understanding. This seems so obvious, at least so obvious to a constructivist, that I'm tempted to treat this as self-evident, and therein lies a trap. For what I have just said is in effect that nothing is self-evident, even if some things often seem evident to us. So I'm going to offer some examples which I think could be persuasive for any of you who do not share my confidence in this key point. Have you ever misheard the lyrics of a song? Perhaps you've been singing a song for some years before realising that your version is not quite the original. Although I suspected that the Asia song Only Time Will Tell included the lines, "Now, sure as the sun will cross the sky, this lie is over," it actually sounded to me more like, "Now, sure as the sun will cross the sky, this lie-in's over," which seemed to fit just as well. Whereas the Marillion song that seemed to include the lyric, "Why are you for your love?" made a lot more sense once I heard a different recording and realised it was actually, "I owe you for your love." According to dubious sources on the web, one of the most common mishearings is of the Dire Straits song Money for Nothing, where "get your chicks for free" was heard as "get your chips for free." I must confess to not hearing that, but had suspected it was "get your checks for free," that is, that someone else would pick up your restaurant bill. Another example cited there is the lyric to I Can See Clearly Now, heard as, "I can see clearly now, the rain is gone." Although I had not made that mistake, there is a song by Status Quo, which even though its title is Rain, still always sounds to me like they're singing either I can't live without the rain, or possibly even I can live without the rain. Similarly, I'd never heard the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds as involving a girl with colitis going by. But, being completely ignorant of the recreational drug scene, I'd wondered what the Eagles were detecting on that dark desert highway in California when, to my ears, the warm smell of colitis was rising up through the air. Do you remember the first time you saw a Necker cube? Or one of those ambiguous images that Gestalt psychologists so liked, that show a duck or a rabbit? Or a vase or two faces? If so, did you immediately appreciate both ways of seeing the image? Or did you have to learn to see an alternative image? Our pattern recognition abilities are considerable, and were no doubt critical during human evolution, but are prone to over-interpretation. So, in perception, we automatically interpret from minimal or ambiguous detail. Have you ever greeted someone that you recognise in a public place, only to find that they were a stranger? Or have you blanked someone you knew well because you initially saw them as a stranger? And if you're aware of sometimes doing that, imagine how often you've not spotted your error when waving to a bemused stranger or ignoring a confused friend. Have you ever found an object that's been in one of your cupboards or drawers for many years and realised that you have no idea what it is, what it's used for, what it was part of, and why you were keeping it? Have you ever been out in a dark place and seen a figure or animal moving, only to then decide it wasn't there and you were just seeing branches moving or some discarded trash being blown around. Have you ever gone to answer the door or a telephone, only to realise you're responding to a sound effect in a television or radio programme or advertisement? The point is not that we do not understand our experiences in the world, but that our understanding is an interpretation that is therefore fallible. So, how do we come to understanding? Well, the human brain seems to have evolved to be a sense-making apparatus that notices patterns in experience and uses those patterns to guide action in the world through developing expectations. Whenever this happens, it's followed by that. So as this is happening, I will now expect that. This largely preconscious process does not require language, even if we need language to describe it. These abstractions of common patterns from experience that inform our tacit expectations establish a fund of interpretive resources. If that was as far as the process went, then our understanding of the world would be little more than vague feelings of satisfaction when our expectations were met, and surprise when the expectations were confounded, or indeed sometimes distress. Of course, humans have culture, and in particular, symbolic systems of representation. And this moves us far beyond dull satisfaction, curiosity, or occasional fear. This means we're no longer reliant on personal experience of the world. A child may be told not to push fingers into main sockets, and to wrap up warmly before leaving the house in winter, and to chew her food carefully before swallowing. Indeed, the weight of parenthood is such that many of us continue to be regularly provided with similar well-meaning advice well into adulthood, and, I've recently discovered, even retirement. I do not have to eat those berries to learn that they will make me sick, because someone has warned me. For that matter, I do not need to build my own particle accelerators, detectors, and analytical programs to discover the Higgs boson, as I can share in the benefits of the experiences of others. Of course, this vicarious benefit from others' experience is no less infallible than interpreting direct experience of the world. I might be told that I can identify a witch by the mark where she feeds her familiar, or that the world's energy needs can be satisfied by a nuclear fusion process that occurs in vitro at room temperature. But of course, just as the world doesn't have an inherent essential meaning that is given to us in perception, nor does a symbolic representation of someone else's ideas. So although I may form an understanding of the Higgs boson by reading texts or listening to an expert, there is no assurance that the understanding I develop will match the understanding of the expert, or even that small part of their understanding that they are seeking to share. Words, diagrams, gestures, and all the rest need to be interpreted as much as any objects or events they are intended to represent. Have you ever received an email in a language you do not know? Have you ever found yourself cited in a paper published in, say, Japanese, Chinese, or Korean, and realised you have no idea what the paper is about? Or have you ever had to trust someone to translate your ideas? The extent to which one can make sense depends upon one's fund of interpretive resources, and that includes familiarity with the forms of representations used to communicate. I used to teach a course with graduate students who came from all over the world and had diverse disciplinary backgrounds, and I had an activity when I had to look at a series of images and discuss what was represented. This included, as some examples, a Confucian saying, a screenshot with Hawkeye modelling superimposed to adjudicate a leg before wicket appeal in cricket, an Aztec calendar, the first few bars of the score of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and the conception of Perseus. I also included the plaque on the side of the Pioneer 10 and 11 spacecraft, intended to communicate to aliens how big humans were and where they could find us if we looked appetising.
We are using this hydrogen transition as the basis of units here. This is where you will find our solar system in relation to the pulsars with shown frequencies, and we live here, on this third planet out from the star. This is us, to scale against the spacecraft you have found. As you see, you should remove protective wrappings before cooking.
The point was, of course, that some of these representations meant little to many in the class, but different class members would bring the particular backgrounds needed to interpret particular images. Making sense of a representation requires having access to specific interpretive resources. Although culture allows us to short-circuit the process of learning by direct experience, this requires a different channel to the spontaneous learning through spotting and testing perceived patterns in our own experience, and so formal educational situations involve the clinical context of the classroom or lecture hall, timetables predetermining when certain subjects are to be engaged with, formal curriculum imposed by authority, and often large classes of learners directed by a single teacher. Human evolution has made us natural learners, but has not optimally equipped us to be natural learners in classroom contexts. Constructivist ideas tell us that learning will be interpretive, incremental, and iterative. Learning is interpretive because the learners have to make sense of new ideas in terms of the fund of interpretive resources they have available. So, constructivism adds a dimension beyond any notion of learning as a linear journey from ignorance to knowledge. Students are often not on a straight path between having no understanding and sharing the teacher's understanding of the topic, or even the teacher's understanding of some simplified curriculum model prescribed as target understanding for learners. Rather, learners come to class with their own ideas about a great many topics that are at odds with canonical accounts, and they interpret teaching in diverse ways. In my field, science education, there are literally thousands of published studies reporting on how particular groups of learners understand various concepts and topics in ways quite different from what is set out in any curriculum. Learning is incremental because the process of building up understanding is limited by the characteristics of the apparatus available, in effect the human brain. I've already mentioned the limitations of working memory, made famous in terms of the so-called magic number, 7 plus or minus 2. That is, a person can only consciously manipulate up to about 7 chunks of information at any one time. However, because the unit is a chunk, and this is a subjective measure, working memory makes learning a very conservative process. What I mean by this being a subjective measure is not that it's a matter of personal choice, as if everyone could design their own tape measure with a subjective personal centimetre of whatever length appealed to them aesthetically. Rather, the cognitive apparatus itself perceives the complexity of information according to the means it has available to make an interpretation. So, consider this figure. How easy would it be to accurately recall the details in this figure later? The answer is dependent on familiarity with both the system of representation and with what is represented. Someone with the right expertise in effect sees this holistically as a gestalt, as they already have the framework for recognising what is represented, being familiar with its structure. For most people, however, this same image represents too much new information to be readily processed without engaging in some strategic memorising heuristics. Whereas most of us could easily remember this image, as long as we can recognise it embeds an already familiar pattern. We are able to chunk what is familiar. A person can treat something quite complex as a single chunk in working memory terms, as long as it's been previously consolidated in long-term memory, or can be understood in terms of what has been previously consolidated in long-term memory. Whereas novel material that is not related to existing understanding is finely chunked as perceived as discrete items of information. That is then that there is a bias in the system, as a few chunks of what is already well understood could amount to an extensive conceptual framework, whereas the unfamiliar has to be processed little by little. It is in that sense that learning is a conservative process. It has a strong bias towards the familiar over the new in terms of processing capacity. So, we should not be surprised when strong arguments do not seem to convince those with long-standing commitments to a different position. We have evolved to not give up well-established commitments readily, as they are well integrated into familiar patterns of thought that can be readily manipulated, whereas novel ideas need to be engaged with piecemeal. Perhaps, therefore, it is completely obvious to some that constructivist teaching is necessary, and equally obvious to others that it must be ineffective. In any case, processing material in working memory does not assure long-term retention, which seems to depend upon processes that take place later outside of conscious awareness and are usually only consolidated by regular reinforcement. Learning is iterative in the sense that each incremental gain in understanding develops the fund of interpretive resources, and so becomes part of what is available to help make sense of further novel information. If what is learnt is misconceived, a misinterpretation of what was intended by a teacher or author, then new information will be interpreted in terms of that misconception, and so will possibly itself be misconceived, so extending and reinforcing a non-canonical way of understanding a topic. What we already understand channels what we next come to understand, and that is equally true regardless of whether that understanding is canonical or a misconception. I mentioned that much work had been done in science education on learners' ideas in many topics. This responds to a research programme that had been set out in a number of influential papers concentrated about the period from around 1978 to the mid-1980s. This programme can be considered to have a hard core of commitments, along the lines:
learning is an active process of constructing personal knowledge. Learners come to learning with existing ideas about many natural phenomena. The learner's existing ideas have consequences for the learning of curriculum material. It is possible to teach more effectively if account is taken of the learner's existing ideas. Knowledge is represented in the brain as a conceptual structure. Learners' conceptual structures exhibit both commonalities and idiosyncratic features. It is possible to meaningfully model learners' conceptual structures.
If this is seen as the creed of the constructivists working in science education, then the most relevant point for teaching practice is that it is possible to teach more effectively if account is taken of the learner's existing ideas. Many of you will recognise this quotation.
If I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach him or her accordingly.
My understanding of what is meant by constructivist teaching is teaching which takes account of these ideas about the nature of learning. The constructivist teacher supports learners in building understanding. The teacher does this by finding out about the learner's current understanding, as this will be the foundation on which new understanding can be built. That is, the learner can only interpret teaching in terms of their particular fund of interpretive resources. If something to be taught depends upon an understanding of calculus, and the learner has no such understanding, then there's little point going ahead to teach anyway and then blaming a failure on the learner's lack of prerequisite knowledge. So diagnostic assessment is valuable to check on expected prerequisite knowledge and to test for common alternative conceptions. Some common alternative conceptions are known to be especially tenacious, and research sometimes suggests particular strategies and activities to help shift student thinking towards canonical understandings. The constructivist teacher breaks down material into manageable learning quanta, in terms of what counts as a chunk of information at the learner's resolution, not from the teacher or expert perspective. The constructivist teacher uses regular formative assessment to make sure learners are understanding teaching as intended and are not interpreting it in alternative ways. As understandings are constructed by the learner and cannot be communicated directly by the teacher, The constructivist teacher does not simply rely on teacher presentation of information or assigning readings, but also adopts active learning where students have to explore, work with and process new ideas. It has been rightly pointed out that active learning means active cognition, and it's quite possible in a quiet, still learner. Members of this audience, experienced scholars with strong metacognitive skills, can effectively learn alone simply by quietly reading a book. However, with most young learners, simply presenting them with extended talk or text is usually not enough to facilitate substantive conceptual learning, especially where this involves radical conceptual change. So, when the teacher does present new ideas to the class, this is done in an interactive dialogue involving students in asking and answering questions and suggesting examples and so forth. That is, the presentation is broken into manageable learning chunks, with the teacher engaging in informal formative assessment to check on how teaching is being interpreted. The teacher seeks to make abstract material more meaningful to students by a range of tactics to help learners relate teaching to their fund of interpretive resources. This can include multimodal communication, words complemented with images and models, and perhaps gestures and so forth. It also includes analogies, metaphors, similes, use of narratives, and so on. The constructivist teacher actively supports students in linking the ideas presented in teaching by being explicit about how what is taught today links to the last lesson and ideas taught in previous weeks, terms and years, and in other curriculum subjects, rather than just assuming that students will spontaneously recognise how the new information is meant to fit into a wider pattern. This is how I understand constructivist teaching, and also how I think of good teaching. I may be wrong, but I suspect most people listening to this talk will find little to object to here, and most of those working in the field of education will find little I've said remarkable. With sufficient familiarity, constructivist teaching can come to seem little more than common sense in terms of what we understand about academic learning. I once had an overseas research student who wanted to study how teachers in England taught according to constructivism, as her own country wanted to adopt similar practices, and it was assumed that England was more progressive, an assumption that was probably only partially correct. I suggested a local teacher, who I knew was an excellent classroom practitioner, and to my mind exemplified constructivist teaching. When the research student asked the teacher what she knew about constructivism, the teacher responded that she didn't recollect having heard the term, although I know it was part of her teacher preparation. She had forgotten the label but not the message. Constructivist teaching is just good teaching that engages learners and best supports their learning. Or at least, that is what we constructivists claim. In some circles, constructivist teaching is certainly not seen this way. Rather, it is seen as some kind of trendy notion which has long been discredited. I imagine the critics picturing those championing constructivist teaching as dangerous, left-wing, anarchistic, sandal-wearing free spirits, with a laissez-faire approach to education, worshipping in the cult of individuality, and somehow thinking that coming to one's own view of things is always more valuable than taking on board accepted wisdom. One critic I read many years ago was a physics professor who felt that the state of science education in the US public school system was terrible, and this was in large part the fault of those people preparing the teachers.
By devaluing scientific knowledge, constructivist educators with no knowledge of science have increased their own power in science education. In the United States, pre-high school science education, such as it is controlled by professional science educators, trained in schools of education which have been notorious for 100 years for their low academic standards. Rare is a science educator who knows even the science expected of an 8th grader. Constructivists believe that each child can learn the scientific process in a rather straightforward manner by observing patterns and making predictions, because of their ignorance of the scientific process. Unfortunately, many science educators are ignorant of the theoretical structure of science. Many are also ignorant of the standard experimental technique that, for good and proper reasons have been used for generations to teach basic scientific principles.
According to Cromer, the people preparing school teachers, constructivist teacher educators, were completely ignorant of science and didn't think it was important for the teachers to know any science. Apparently, constructivists think science is about process, and process can be learned without any specific content. So, science learning should be open-ended inquiry, and it was less important what was found out, as long as the children did their own inquiries. Indeed, it didn't matter if what they found out was contrary to accepted science. Now, I have no direct knowledge of US school systems, so cannot comment on the extent to which this critique reflected actual practices, except to say that for Cromer, these incompetent and dangerous teacher educators were constructivists, and that seemed to be the essence of their evil ways. In the second half of the 20th century, there was indeed a movement to shift science teaching from being all about what had already been found out by great scientists, normally seen as almost exclusively dead men of European heritage, working alone against the odds, to teaching more about the nature and processes and practices of science. However, in most parts of the world, this was never a movement to replace teaching science content, just to give it more context and offer a better reflection of how science does come to its findings. Clearly, good teaching involves both disciplinary practices and disciplinary knowledge. To paraphrase Einstein, teaching science content without context is irrelevant, and teaching science process without substance is pointless. There is certainly some truth in there being a move to have a strong focus on inquiry in science teaching, but that hardly seems inappropriate. Yet I cannot so easily dismiss the more recent debate in the US, which has presented constructivist teaching as one element in a discredited set of pedagogies now proved to be ineffective. That is, the failure of constructivist, discovery, problem-based, experiential and inquiry-based teaching.
The minimally guided approach has been called by various names including discovery learning, problem-based learning, inquiry learning, experimental learning, and constructivist learning. Examples of applications of these differently named but essentially pedagogically equivalent approaches include science instruction, in which students are placed in inquiry learning contexts and asked to discover the fundamental and well-known principles of science by modelling the investigatory activities of professional researchers. Similarly, medical students in problem-based teaching courses are required to discover medical solutions for common patient problems.
The supposed commonality here is that these approaches all involve minimal guidance. These authors are saying that if we want children to learn things, we could try telling them, rather than waiting for them to discover them for themselves. Kirshner and colleagues are not against discovery, but are against the pedagogy of refusing to tell learners anything and expecting discoveries to be made in a vacuum. They're not against inquiry, but they are against leaving learners to engage in open-ended inquiry without structured support. Well, I agree entirely, and I'm a committed constructivist. Now again, I'm not sure to what extent Kirshner and colleagues are attacking a straw man, as it seems to me obvious that you do not let children loose in the laboratory and expect them to rediscover what it took the most accomplished and highly trained scientists working in supportive institutional contexts and communities many years of full-time work to discover. Yet I'm also aware that one of the great proponents of constructivism in science education, the late Ross Driver, was critical of how, in teaching she observed in the States, it was expected that learners would rediscover scientific laws through practical activities undertaken with limited structuring by teachers.
The more simplistic interpretations of the discovery approach in science suggest that we only need to give pupils the opportunity to explore events and phenomena at first hand, and they will be able to induce the generalizations and principles themselves. The position suggested here is that children do make generalizations from their first-hand experiences, but these may not be the ones the teacher has in mind. Explanations do not spring clearly or uniquely from data. The constructivist view of science, on the other hand, indicates the fallacy here. If we wish children to develop an understanding of the conventional concepts and principles of science, more is required than simply providing practical experiences. The theoretical models and scientific conventions will not be discovered by children through their practical work. They need to be presented, Guidance is then needed to help children assimilate their practical experiences into what is possibly a new way of thinking about them.
Her criticism motivated her constructivist program to develop teaching schemes informed by research into learners' ideas. A genuinely constructivist approach would actually start by providing very strong structured support, and only fade this as the learner develops autonomous expertise. Constructivist teaching seeks optimal guidance informed by the current progress of the learner. It may not go as far towards teacher-centered instruction as some proponents of so-called direct instruction would like, but it certainly would not be minimally guided. Open-ended discovery, an inquiry with minimal input from a teacher, is not constructivist teaching. It is indeed antithetical to constructivist teaching, at least as this has been understood by researchers in science education. So why do critics think that constructivists want to teach about prescribed science content? To allow learners to develop their own findings, regardless of their match with canonical science, and to let students get on and find things out for themselves. When constructivism in science education is actually much more about how to best lead learners towards canonical understandings. Perhaps this is in part a difference in emphasis between places like the UK, mainland Europe, Australia and New Zealand on the one hand, and the US, where maybe there are radical educational constructivists who believe something's only worth knowing if you worked it all out by yourself. I'm not sure how Canada fits here. So perhaps this comes back to there not being a shared understanding of what constructivism in education actually is. I put actually in scare quotes as constructivism is not a natural kind, but a made-up human construct. So there is nothing that constructivism inherently is, as it has no essence independently of how it's understood. It is better to say perhaps that this comes back to there not being a sufficiently shared understanding of which classroom practices should sensibly be labelled constructivist. Perhaps. Given what I have said so far, I would not expect understandings to be fully shared, as we each construct our own understandings in an interpretive, incremental and iterative way. I suspect, however, that a key issue is a distinction between prescription and description. Constructivists, or at least so-called personal constructivists, base their ideas on an account of learning as necessarily an interpretive construction process that can only happen in the minds of learners, and inevitably means that individuals construct personal understandings that will therefore sometimes be at odds with canonical and curriculum accounts. Constructivist teaching is not designed to encourage or even to celebrate any of this, but simply pragmatically to take it into account and teach in the best way possible given the constraints of how humans learn. Some critics seem, however, to interpret educational constructivists as wanting learners to develop their own understandings because of some kind of ideological imperative. Do not worry about what those old scientists found out. All that is important is what you think. The ideas your imagination can come up with, what works for you. If you do not like Newton's laws of motion, great, make up your own. If you think the idea that all life on Earth has a common ancestor is silly, then stand up for your ideas and reject evolution. If you think there's no gravity on the moon because there's no air there, fine. Do not think too deeply about the footage of those Apollo missions showing astronauts walking about on the moon's surface, or ask why they had to use rockets to get the lander back into orbit. No. Constructivist educators know that simply presenting the canonical ideas without taking into account how understanding is built up iteratively, incrementally, and interpretively often leads to limited or misunderstanding. Constructivist approaches are necessary to work with the cognitive processes and limitations that are inherent to human learning, to best shift learners towards canonical accounts. So much for education. But what about the wider objections, which might be considered the philosophical criticisms? I think something similar is going on there.
Educational theory, weak to begin with, has completely sunk into the swampy waters of postmodernist nihilism and relativism, and there are few educators who know enough arithmetic to balance a checkbook. dubious and abstract theoretical issues revolving around the themes of constructivism, relativism and other philosophical isms. I think that if one looks closely at the basic philosophical positions offered by some contemporary chemical constructivists, one sees many radical themes that are not only open to serious questioning but can also be construed as being anti-scientific. Contemporary educational constructivism is a heady mixture of the supposedly psychological thesis that children must construct their own knowledge and the supposedly Kuhnian epistemological thesis that all knowledge is relative and paradigm-dependent.
Perhaps because my background is science and science teaching, I'm especially aware of how some from science backgrounds see constructivism in education as not only misinformed pedagogy, but as reflecting the influence of anti-scientific and anti-rationalist ideas that have been allowed to seep into science teaching through the influence of ideologically unsound educators. That is, constructivist educators, no doubt such as myself.
Philosophers of science have devoted a disproportionate amount of intellectual effort to defences of realism. An apologist for science does well to eschew relativism in all its forms, for the simple amongst our audience require a neat dualist scheme with a clear demarcation of good and evil and no equivocations or complications.
There is a fair argument that can be made that if science educators are rejecting a scientific basis for their own work, then this offers a backdoor into the scientific education of young people for all kinds of nonsense. However, given my past experience of working with science graduates entering teaching, I am not sure that a certain amount of subversive, sceptical, fifth column activity in science teacher education would necessarily be such a terrible thing. If only to challenge a common acceptance of a kind of naive empiricism, which gives many science graduates false confidence in how teacher demonstrations and class practical work will spontaneously support the learning of canonical science. That is, if anything, I suspect that where teachers have trusted in minimally guided discovery learning, this comes more from an uncritical adoption of foundationalist commitments to how scientific data unproblematically becomes evidence, rather than any influence of constructivist ideas. Once again, then, constructivists are on the side of the good. But I promise to give the critics a hearing. Science is an objective process that respects evidence and tests ideas and reaches community consensus. Yet, critics will suggest, these constructivists seem to want to celebrate and validate every idiosyncratic conception learners come up with. Rather than dismissing students' alternative conceptions and spending time reinforcing target knowledge in the curriculum, class time is wasted eliciting and therefore encouraging and reinforcing learners' misplaced ideas. That is a decent argument, and indeed it may sometimes be correct. Sometimes learners' odd ideas would fade by themselves once they were taught the canonical accounts if we just ignored those odd ideas. But certainly not always. Research suggests that ignoring learners' ideas is often educationally disastrous. So constructivist educators value learners' own ideas not because they are inherently as worthy as canonical accounts, but because they're the only starting points available for developing student thinking. By definition, a commitment to development, conceptual development, intellectual development, moral development, professional development, implies accepting the current state of affairs as the starting point. We can start where the learner is and make some progress, or we can ignore where the learner is and teach over their heads and have little impact. The educational choice is then obvious, and critics of constructivism are again misunderstanding the motivation for the choice. But this is not the only source of unease. The label constructivist has often been attached to certain forms of social research. In particular, those where it's acknowledged that research results are inevitably the researcher's own interpretations of data, rather than, say, measurements taken with some objective instrument are made into conclusions through perfectly replicable statistical tests. Educational research that is constructivist often seems to reject overtly scientific methods, proper experiments, the use of representative samples and statistics, and instead adopts inherently subjective approaches that focus on individual cases and acknowledge that the results of studies rely on the use of the investigator as a subjective instrument to interpret what participants are saying. Results are therefore unrepresentative, ungeneralisable, and not open to replication. In a word, it might be suggested, unscientific. These criticisms deserve a full seminar of their own to be dealt with adequately, but here I'll point out that I accept such an account, apart from the last point, that such work should be assumed unscientific. The methods used have to reflect the nature of what is being studied and the kinds of knowledge it's possible to have about such phenomena. The nature of education as a social activity means researchers are not dealing with natural kinds like crystals or viruses, and so methods suitable in the natural sciences do not readily apply. The kinds of knowledge it's possible to develop about another person's thinking or understanding is different in nature to the kind of knowledge it's possible to have about acidic solutions, or the motion of marbles on a smooth surface, or the genetic structure of an organism. And assuming a greater level of objectivity than is possible is what would really be unscientific. By applying appropriate methods for the materials studied, a researcher seeks to be more scientific. Again, the choice made by constructivist researchers is not an ideological rejection of objective methods, but doing the best job considering the nature of the task in hand. The common assumption that experiment is the gold standard methodology for generating knowledge and is the scientific method is flawed in a number of respects. For one thing, it ignores the nature of those natural scientific fields where true experiments are not feasible. For another, it focuses on the testing of hypotheses and ignores how these are generated in the first place. It also ignores the nature of social kinds, such as teachers or classes or schools or lessons, which do not readily allow the forms of generalisation or replication that are possible in the natural sciences when studying natural kinds like pure samples of a chemical substance. It also ignores the embedded nature of teaching and learning, which cannot be excised from their context for clinical investigation without substantially modifying them. It also ignores how human beings change their behaviour in response to expectations and beliefs about research interventions, and to having special attention, such as an investigator's attention paid to them. And it usually ignores the way behaviour, such as teaching behaviour, changes as something becomes familiar and largely tacit. There are many experiments in the educational literature, but most of them are clearly flawed in at least some of these respects. Those that are informative about specific participants are often of more limited value in informing education beyond the original context. I would argue, indeed have argued, that in science education at least, the bias towards aping scientific methods often leads to poor quality and sometimes unethical experiments. Even so, I would not deny that educational experiments could be informative, but they are most useful when complemented by other types of research. So, again, the common adoption of methods that seem subjective, because they rely on the interpretation of qualitative data, and therefore depend on the intersubjectivity that allows an analyst to build rapport and enter into dialogue with participants, and use her own fund of interpretive resources to make sense of the ideas and experiences of others, is not a choice made because subjectivity is seen as inherently preferable to objectivity, but rather a recognition that true objectivity is not a viable option. So again, the genuinely scientific approach is that which acknowledges the nature of what is researched and the kinds of knowledge claims it is feasible to seek. There is, however, one further feature of constructivism that is a particular cause for concern for some critics. This is an aspect of what has been called radical constructivism, which to someone long engaged with constructivist thinking does not seem radical at all, of course. This is the idea that not just our research, but our reality is necessarily subjective, in the sense that we can never know external reality as it is, only as we interpret it. This is linked to key themes of the culture wars and ideas about whether there is an objective reality we can know, which science more closely approaches over time, or whether each person has their own personal reality which is independent of any external reality, if indeed such a thing even exists, with alternative reality being the creation of human minds. Some social constructionists or social constructivists seem to think that reality exists by agreement in communities, rather than being something that exists independently of and prior to human cognition. That is one step from suggesting truth is relative to time and place. Here we do then run into the problem I alluded to earlier of there being different flavours of constructivism, which may suggest quite different meanings for the term. I'm not sure if there are many in my field of science education who would claim that we create reality rather than it being out there. But of course words mean whatever we want them to mean, and if reality is understood to mean reality as experienced, then that reality is constructed in human cognition, and we each have our own personal world in which we live. But the fundamental question is about whether there is an independent physical universe which would still exist if no one was here to engage in it. I think the science education community, almost to a person, would say yes, even if they acknowledged not being absolutely certain of this. For that matter, I think any philosophers who may deny this professionally when on duty still use it as a working assumption in their own private lives. Whether we can truly know that external world is another matter, given that human cognition has inherent limitations and biases, and given that all our coming to know is based on interpretive, incremental, and so iterative processes. Clearly a constructivist has to retain some scepticism here. We can never be absolutely sure we have fully understood the nature of the external world as an independent neutral reality. Some feel that makes the constructivist perspective unscientific, as a central tenet of science is that there is an objective reality which science can investigate and come to know. Yet in practice, the divide is illusionary.
Social constructivism and realism are neither live options, nor comfortably dead letters. They are vampires, the philosophical undead that still haunt our concepts and interpretations of nature, culture, and science.
Increasingly, research shows how psychological and sociological factors influence scientists' ideas and interpretations, even though they seek to be objective. Scientists are human beings, and not perfect devices for making sense of nature. Naive positivism is just that, naive. A belief in an independent reality is one thing. A belief that we're able to know its full and true nature is hard to justify, except on metaphysical grounds that are ideological and extra-scientific. Without the faith that many early Islamic and European scientists had, that humans could understand nature because God wanted us to appreciate his works, it's very hard to see on what basis we can assume the universe is truly knowable to us, no matter how much we may want that to be so. We know science is fallible, and a central scientific value is that all scientific ideas are open to revisiting in the light of new evidence or new ways of interpreting existing evidence. A notion that science can offer a complete and final account of reality is not scientific, it is scientistic. Educational constructivists, or at least the ones I've read, are not really arguing anything different. The dispute is not about ontology, but about how much ground needs to be given epistemologically in terms of understanding the world. Most constructivists accept the existence of an independent reality, but just do not think we can know exactly what it is. We do not have direct, unmediated knowledge of the world, as we're limited by the constraints and biases of being human. These constructivists do not argue that we can have no idea, for when you decide to walk through a wall, or to stop eating to live off sunshine, or to hold your breath for an hour, there are real consequences, which give us pretty useful clues about the nature of that reality. We can build a pretty good picture from some of those clues, and we can test the expectations it offers us against future experience, and make revisions where indicated. Constructivists certainly do not deny any of this, but simply argue that the process is necessarily imperfect. We spontaneously make such tests and revisions individually, even if we are good at fooling ourselves by interpreting experience to fit expectations, in keeping with the conservative nature of our cognition. Scientific practices have developed much more rigorous and systematic approaches that help us be much more critical of our interpretations. But observations are still theory-laden. Many of the phenomena of modern science are only produced through complex laboratory manipulation. Experiments are always testing compounds of hypotheses plus auxiliary assumptions, and evidence always underdetermines theory. Science is amazingly powerful, but like all human institutions, has its limitations. The distance between the typical educational constructivist and the typical believer in the objectivity of science is simply a matter of degree. But that is to be expected, because one camp is concerned with how communities of well-trained, well-equipped, full-time professional scientists make sense of the world, and the other camp is concerned with how the typical learner in a school class makes sense of teaching. It would be bizarre to expect the same level of confidence in the knowledge-generating sophistication of people in these very different contexts. Indeed, you may have been astute enough to notice that for much of my discussion of learning, I referred to developing understandings rather than knowledge. As a true constructivist has little use for traditional notions of knowledge as true justified belief, as this assumes someone can infallibly judge what is true. In summary, as a constructivist, I recognise the concerns of some of those who feel that constructivism is bad pedagogy or dangerous ideology. In the first case, I think there is a severe misjudgment on what genuine constructivist teaching actually comprises. In the second case, I think a degree of difference has been misinterpreted as a difference in kind. Certainly, as I construe it, constructivism is both good pedagogy, that has little in common with the minimal guidance of bad teaching, and is also perfectly consistent with modern notions of the nature of science, rather than being aligned with philosophical stances that seem abhorrent to many in the scientific community. However, a constructivist view of how we come to understand our experiences suggests there's no mystery about the paradoxical way in which educational constructivism is understood so variously. People come to their views through processes which are interpretive, incremental, and iterative, so I can appreciate how different groups come to construe constructivism as variously good, bad, or abhorrent.